Hi everybody. Today we're going to talk about multiplying positive and negative numbers together and what happens when you do this. Okay. Before we start, let's think about all the different possible combinations there are. When we take two numbers and they can be positive or negative, how many different combinations can we get when we multiply? You might remember we played this game when we were adding positive and negative numbers too. So let's start. Most people come up with positive times positive. That's going to be our first combination. You've been doing this since you were in second grade, maybe. And now we have negative numbers, so of course we could come up with a negative number times a negative number. And then, of course, there's the positive number times a negative number. Now, some folks might think, hey, a positive number times a negative number, well, then I could also have a negative number times a positive number, right? Shouldn't that be a fourth combination? But I want you to remember that in multiplication, there's a property called the commutative property. And you might remember the commutative property means that numbers can be flipped. It doesn't matter which one comes first. So negative 6 times 5 should be the same thing as 5 times negative 6. In all other multiplication problems, we're able to flip the numbers around and not change the answer or change the value of the multiplication problem. So I'm sure it'll work here too. We'll investigate a little bit later. Let's put a little asterisk there. And when we get to that, we'll do a little investigating. All right, well, let's start at the top. Positive times a positive. What happens when we multiply a positive number times a positive number? Well, let's give it a shot here. What if we did 4 times 5, right? We know that should equal 20. And here I'm going to illustrate it. We've got a 5 plus a 5 plus a 5 plus a 5 plus a 5. And sure enough, that equals 20. So it looks like a positive number times a positive number makes a positive number. That's no surprise to anybody here, all right? Let's get to the interesting stuff. What happens when we multiply a negative number times a negative number? Let's say negative 3 times negative 4. Well, let's think about it like this. I know what 3 times negative 4 would look like. It would look like that. But we're being asked for the negative 3 times negative 4. Right? Which makes your head kind of hurt when you think about it. What does that mean, the negative 3 times or negative 3 groups? Well, think about it like this. There's 3 groups of negative 4, and we want the negative of it. Right? So here's a little illustration of the negative of 3 groups of negative 4. Right? So what they're asking us essentially is, what's the negative of negative 12? Again, my head is starting to hurt trying to think about that. So this might help. Let's think of a negative as the opposite. And now if I ask you, what's the opposite of negative 12? You'd be quick to reply, oh, it's 12. Positive 12. And that, in fact, is the case, right? Negative 3 groups of negative 4, or the opposite of 3 groups of negative 4, is 12. It's true. Here's another way you can think about it, although this is not quite as easy to digest. It's not quite as easy as thinking of it as the opposite. We can think of negative as subtraction, right? So, for example, what if I said subtract 3 groups of negative 4? Well, 3 groups of negative 4 is negative 12. And if I want to subtract negative 12, well, subtracting means adding the opposite. So again, we come out with positive 12. Okay? I prefer to think the opposite. But in the end, you just need to remember that if it's negative times a negative, it makes a positive product. Right? So let's look at these first 2 rules here. It turns out that rule 1 and 2 are kind of the same. If the signs are the same, the product will be positive. So a positive times a positive is a positive. A negative times a negative is a positive. That's the rule we need to remember. Okay, let's move on. This is a good one too. This is something we haven't seen before, and that is a negative times a positive. So let's take a look at one. Let's look at negative 3 times 4. Right? Building on what we just saw on the previous slide, I'm going to say there's 3 groups of 4. That's 12. And because we want the negative of 3 groups of 4, I'm going to say that is negative 12. All right? But earlier we said that multiplication has the commutative property, so I should be able to flip these around and write a positive times a negative, like 4 times negative 3. You see the integers are the same. I've just traded places using the commutative property. So let's see if 4 groups of negative 3 give us the same answer. Negative 3 plus negative 3 plus negative 3 plus negative 3. Let's see. 3 and 6 is 9, and 9 plus 3 is 12. And they're all negative teams as points. Yep, negative 12. So here's 2 examples. And I would say in the first one, trying to think of the opposite of 3 times 4 sometimes makes my head hurt, right? It's a little confusing. I prefer to think about this one down here. So whenever I see a negative times a positive, I like to just flip them over so the positive number comes first. And I can just say 4 groups of negative 3. And that's easy to conceive of. It's easy to think about. It's just negative 3 plus another negative 3 plus another negative 3. So if you see a multiplication problem where there's 2 different signs, try and rearrange them using the commutative property so that the positive number comes first. Have I said commutative property enough times yet? All right. That's it, I think. So this is really just one combination, right? I'm going to call it positive times negative. Either way, you come out with what kind of answer? A negative answer. Right? So when the signs are different, you get a negative answer. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, let's put it all down on paper here. These are the rules for multiplying positive and negative numbers. There's only 2. Right? The first one, if the signs are the same, the product will be positive. Rule number 2, if the signs are different, the product will be negative. And that's all you need to remember. Great. Thanks so much. Tomorrow we'll talk about dividing.